All right. Folks, thank you for joining us. My name is James Perry. I serve as CEO of the Winston-Salem Urban League, and I want to welcome everyone. Looks like we have about 20 or so people joining us right now on Zoom, and we've been doing this. This is the fifth evening that we've of these webinars, and we've generally had about 50 to 100 people to also join us on Facebook Live, and then usually after the event is over, then a few hundred or so people will watch the event on Facebook. We've had as many as 2,000 people to watch some of these events on Facebook, and so it's been a real success. I want to thank some of the folks who've been returning almost every night. I think the award winner for joining us, I think almost every night is probably Magali Yacinth. Mag, thank you for joining, and thank you for being so supportive. We really appreciate you. I think, as many of you know, this is Black Lives Matter. Protest to policy. And of course, the idea here is to have a conversation about how we move all of the energy that's in the streets into true reform. We want to make sure that when we're 10, 20, 30 years down the line, that we look back and of course, we are proud of all the activity that happened in the streets, but that we can see the actual change that has occurred in our communities. And so we want to make sure that we are harnessing the energy in a way that truly transforms our communities and our lives. And so tonight's conversation, of course, is about policing and about reforming policing and about criminal justice. On Monday night, we talked about voting rights. On Tuesday night, we talked about education reform. On Wednesday night, we talked about economic justice and economic opportunities. On Thursday night, we talked about affordable housing. And so it's been a really robust set of conversations with an amazing set of experts, all of whom volunteered their time. And in a moment, I'll introduce our guests for tonight. But today is a true holiday for the African American community, and so it is certainly a day that everyone should take off, but particularly those in the African American community. And so it's a big deal, certainly, that he is volunteering his time. Before I go any further, I want to take a moment and introduce my colleague, who is my partner in progress here, Reverend Alvin Carlisle. Oftentimes people will talk about how do we make sure that our civil rights organizations are working together in order to get things done on behalf of their communities. Well, I'll tell you that since the very moment that I met Reverend Alvin Carlisle, what he said to me is that at every single point that the Urban League and the NAACP can work together, let's do it. And that's what we've done. And so I want to turn it over to Reverend Carlisle so he can offer comments and greetings.
Greetings to everyone. Give you a big Juneteenth greeting to everyone. Definitely a beautiful day of remembrance, of memorial, and for celebration for us today. It's just good to be here on this final night as we've been dealing with this 5-part series dealing with from protest to policy. And the conversations, as James has said, have been great. Looking forward to tonight. Again, you all, we're just hoping that everyone will stay connected. Let's make sure that good work comes out of this effort. I was talking to my friend Dawn Blakegrove today. She's in Fayetteville. They're having a set of protests down there, and there needs to be a statewide movement to establish the kind of policing policy that we could be proud of around this state. And it's going to take all of us to pull together, state, local, federal, and make some real great, good changes. And so, again, I'm grateful to James and the work he does. He called us partners. He's really more Chuck D. I'm Flavor Flav.
That ain't true.
I'm Flavor Flav. I'm just a hype man, keeping it lively. But no, I really appreciate his partnership in the work, and we just hope that good stuff is going to come out of these five series, 5 town hall sessions, and looking forward to having even great dialogue tonight.
Absolutely. And so with that, let's go ahead and move into the substantive conversation. And I want to introduce Dr. Jack Monell. I think subconsciously, perhaps I've been stalking Dr. Monell for some time. I think in part because his presence on social media is rather ubiquitous, particularly if you're in Winston-Salem. You can't avoid him. Even if you don't follow him, he's going to pop up on other people's social media pages and I think that probably has a lot to do with how he engages as a professor at Winston-Salem State University. Dr. Monell is an associate professor and program coordinator of justice studies at Winston-Salem State University. He has over 20 years of working in the fields of social work, criminal justice, and in human services. He's a scholarly practitioner with a broad range of experiences, both personal and professional. He's worked for nonprofit, for local and state and federal government agencies, and he's the author of a preliminary examination of hegemonic masculinity, a definitional transference of Black masculinity, effective lethal tactics against Black males. When we began to talk about having this conversation, and I started to reach out to folks and say, well, who is it that we ought to reach out to locally in order to talk about policy issues around policing in Winston-Salem? Over and over again, everyone said Dr. Monell is the person to bring into this conversation, and they talked both about his scholarly acumen, but and they said that number one, that's important, but also that he understands community, and he understands this community, and look, he understands the challenges that the African American community faces when it comes to policing. And he lives in this community, and so he understands the challenges and certainly also the opportunities that exist in this community. When we put together this event, we were, I think, rushing, because I think we of course realize that time is of the essence. We know that right now there's pressure because people are protesting, and I know that elected officials feel the pressure of the protests. And as we were putting it together, I certainly hadn't even thought about the fact that today was Juneteenth, and that for all intents and purposes, it should be a day to celebrate. But the thing that happens far too often for all of us who are activists is that we never stop the work. And as much as I think Dr. Monell intended to take some time to do the thing that we should be doing today, and when I reached out to him and said we wanted to have this important conversation, he did what a true committed activist does, and he said, well, it's a conversation that I can't pass up. So Dr. Monell, we appreciate you. We appreciate your time. And I'd like to ask you to just offer a few opening comments to folks.
Absolutely. First and foremost, thank you for the invitation. If James is Chuck D and Reverend Alvin is Flavor Flav, then quite arguably I'm Terminator X. So yeah, once again, thank you. That introduction was overly, I'm not worthy, but I do appreciate the sentiments, and it has been a timely discussion as it pertains to the work we're doing here in Winston-Salem and the surrounding area. For those unaware, I am at Winston-Salem State University, go Rams, and I am incredibly passionate about the work that needs to be done for our community, and quite frankly, I'm encouraged and excited to see the momentum, what's happening, not only, within our state, our country, but globally. So I look forward to engaging all of you. We're definitely gonna have a pretty cool conversation, a necessary conversation about what we think, works, what hasn't worked, and hopefully what will work. So I look forward to engaging with all of you. I obviously look forward to engaging with my brothers on the panel. And thank you once again for the invitation.
Absolutely. So look, I think one of the big challenges in having a conversation about policing is that every single time that we've, at least certainly since I've been involved in this kind of work, that we've ended up at a moment like this, is that it oftentimes erupts because of a major issue that's happened in another community, right? And so in this circumstance, initially it's Ahmaud Arbery's death that happens in Georgia. And I think in part that's because there wasn't very much attention to Breonna Taylor's death in Louisville, Kentucky. And but obviously, and thankfully that has ramped up. And then eventually we see George Floyd's death in Minneapolis. All of those are very different jurisdictions. And then of course we see another shooting happen just in the last 2 weeks in Atlanta, another death. And every one of those jurisdictions has handled the results very, very differently. We haven't had a recent police murder or shooting, frankly, in Winston-Salem. And but clearly there's a lot of pent up anxiety and frustration. And clearly there are a lot of young folks who've had difficult interactions with the police. So, I guess one of the places where I want to start is simply with talking about the relationship between young people and the African American community in general with the police, whereby even when there hasn't been a recent major shooting or murder in your community, when right away people so clearly identify with a murder that happens so far away, what does that mean about the relationship that people locally have with police in this community and in communities around the country?
Well, what I've noticed, and one to put it into context, I'm a transplant to North Carolina. I'm a Yankee, so I grew up in New York City, but I've been in North Carolina now going on probably 14 years, give or take. So this is indeed my home, from Charlotte all the way up to Winston. So Charlotte, a much larger city. What I'm noticing collectively in my communications with folks, out of state, particularly, especially in those areas where these murders occurred, is that the relationships, as you so well stated, we've always had a strained relationship as a community, particularly when you look at Black men, Black young men in many of these communities. And unfortunately, what you find is when you have such scarred relationships, strained relationships, there's a lack of trust between young people and of course, the law enforcement community, who arguably supposed to be there to protect and serve, and we'll get into that much later. So for me, what I find is that right now, even though we haven't had such a shooting here in our city, respectively, people are still drawn to it because the last time I checked, we all look like each other, skin-wise. We vary in shade, but nonetheless, when it comes down, when we see a brother get killed in Kentucky or in Atlanta or in New York or a sister, in Kentucky, we feel that. We all have brothers, we all have sisters. And I think what we're seeing today in Winston, you're seeing the young people, particularly the college age kids and some of the more senior age citizens, collaboratively joining because they're just kind of frustrated at what we're seeing. They're like, enough is enough. Granted, it's not necessarily affecting us directly here, but that's not to say it never will. So, we're just being vigilant and letting our local law enforcement, community know, we respect, we'll respect you, but nonetheless, we need to be respected as well. And we're going to speak out against these injustices.
Sure. So now there's another, I think, phenomenon, that makes, I think, North Carolina unique, and Winston-Salem is part of that. So, it turns out there are 6 jurisdictions where there are Black women who are police chiefs in North Carolina, and we happen to be one where Katrina Thompson is the police chief here. And there is this, I think, always this challenge about when it comes to Black law enforcement, right? Where on one hand you kind of always hope that when you engage with Black law enforcement that there's some benefit of the doubt that they'll give you, and that you won't get harassed in some particular way or discriminated against because of your race. But then there are always these stories, and lots of folks who have experiences. And frankly, I have an experience where I've been treated just as bad, if not worse, by African American law enforcement. On the flip side, one of the experiences that I certainly have had here, and I think that there are other folks who are African American civil rights leaders here who've been able to pick up the phone and call the leadership of the police department and have really frank civil conversations that I haven't been able to have with white leadership of police departments in other cities. And so I'm curious if and I apologize because I'm not familiar enough with your work and with your studies enough to know if this is something that you've studied or that you've reviewed over time. But I'm curious about your thoughts about what the role of Black leadership, and particularly of Black women leading a police department is, and whether or not there is some transformative effect when it comes to how that impacts the way that a force polices a community.
So quite frankly, yes. What you find here particularly, there's something to be said even with optics, right? So, whereas some of our experiences with Black law enforcement may have not been as favorable as we would have thought, for whatever reason, the reality of it is, as young people, as a community, we're, depending on the relationship with the respective community, having Black leadership in law enforcement is vital, is instrumental in that first step of transforming those respective departments. And quite frankly, to your point, when we look at, former Chief Roundtree or the chief now, Thompson, or Sheriff Bobby Kimbrough, these are individuals who have openly stated that they want to work with activists, with leadership in our city to ensure that what we see across the television doesn't occur here in Winston-Salem. So in my research, and quite ironically, presently, I did a three-state study on policing interactions with Black males, and this is cross demographics, cross races, ages, genders, and what I found is even some of the Black officers where at times you feel there's empathy because of the obvious connection, what you find often is that the power of that blue sometimes puts them in a very precarious situation. And very rarely can they initially speak out. You've seen instances like in Buffalo, New York, where there was a Black female officer some years ago who restrained her white colleague who was choking out a defendant, and she got fired. And no benefits. Of course, recently, because of all what was occurring, she was able to get her pension. But it's instances like that, you always hear, it's only a few bad apples. This is a common term here, it's only a few bad apples. Well, doggone it, if there's only a few bad apples, they keep coming from a rotten tree. So, my thing is, and listen, I'm encouraged. I'm from New York, so I lived in a larger city, and we can talk for hours about the NYPD in a way that's probably not as flattering. But the reality of it is, here in Winston, which we're not necessarily a super large city per se, but I am comforted in knowing, to your point, that if I see something occurring and I don't like the way it smells, I can reach out to Sheriff Bobby Kimbrough or one of his executive officers, and we can have a conversation and dialogue civilly about, hey, listen, how can we make this better? And that helps relationships because it shows accountability. And that's the one thing I do notice. You ask any of the chief or the sheriff, the first thing they'll say is, if my officers are wrong, if my deputies are wrong, we're going to hold them accountable. And that shows the community that it allows for us as citizens to have some faith in the process and the equity of the process.
And Dr. Monell, I'm also a transplant, right? So I'm from New Orleans, and when my wife and I moved here, we were commuting back and forth between New Orleans and New York, and so we were in New York for about 5 years. And so we were in New York during the height of the stop and
frisk
movement, right? And which just offering just a personal anecdote for the moment. We were living in Manhattan, and we were we're pretty close to. We were in a majority white part of Manhattan, right? And I would hear all these stories about stop and frisk. And I was like, I never see any police officers. I never see stop and frisk happen. And for the most part, I cut my own hair. I need to cut my own hair right now. But so one day I decided to hop on the train and go up to Harlem to get a haircut. And the moment I get off of the train in Harlem, I see nothing but officers, and I see them grab a guy, black guy, and throw him up against the wall and frisk him, and then let him go. And then I walk 10 more feet and I see the exact same thing happen. By the time I get to the barber, which is only like 5 feet from getting off the train, I see him stop and frisk at least 10 different guys. And I'm like, I'm shocked. I'm blown away. And I don't even want a haircut anymore because I'm like, this doesn't even make any sense, right? But so, but would you take a moment now and tell us some more about your research?
Sure. So the last 3 years, what I've done, and I've focused a lot of my research on Black masculinity, hegemonic masculinity, and just to make it plain for the viewers, ultimately what that means is studying how masculinity is applied in our society. So historically speaking, what you found is African slaves, when they came, when we were enslaved and brought here, we were brutally victimized and traumatized and physically taught how to be overly aggressive, hyper masculine, not to think, but just to use our prowess. So for me, what I wanted to focus on is why does popular culture continue to manipulate and perpetuate that? Because what I found is in my research, obviously, if any one of us walks down, a pretty upper middle class community, suited and booted, arguably people are going to call the police because they say we don't belong or we look threatening, And so I oftentimes caution my colleagues when it comes down, appearance is one thing, but it shouldn't matter if I have a hoodie on and some sweats, or if I have a blazer on or a t-shirt on, I'm still a human. And I think that apathy generationally, is what I focus on as it pertains to how people view us. And then more recently, I transferred that and added the police element, because once again, why is it? And we see it time and time again, and the research supports this. Why is it that when police engage with an African-American male, they go 0 to 60? But in Michigan, last month, you had white protesters spitting on cops' faces with machine guns and grenade launches and everything else, but apparently they had patience and resolve. So that's the stuff. It's like, why is it that you're quick to jump on us? My thing is be equitable, right? If you're gonna jump on me, jump on it too. So that's kind of what I focus on, and focus on how, and all of us obviously, give or take a few years, a lot of us come from, I'm a Generation Xer. So, we remember the period. We remember the solidarity. We remember how we were treated in our respective areas. Shoot, New Orleans is there. Listen, we can probably talk for another hour about that. So my thing is, I wanted to focus on the whys. As criminologists, that's what we do. Why is it that people view us a certain way? Why is it that people have zero to little apathy as it pertains to Black males? Because I have Black sons, I worry about them as they leave. When I leave, I know how to talk the talk for the most part, so I know how to handle those levels of interactions. But that's not to say that I can't be caught in a precarious situation either. So a lot of my research focuses on that and trying to change our narrative. That's why I do all these things, so people can listen and be like, what's this dude talking about? Because the reality of it is, you guys know, television, music, videos, print media, every time they perpetuate a Black male, they have us looking like we some thugged out gangbanger, drug dealing pimp, but heaven forbid. And a part of this, in my last publication, think about it. Denzel Washington, one of my favorite actors. Man, I love that dude, right? Incredible admiration for him. All these roles he played, Malcolm X, all these other, Mo Better Blues, all that other stuff. You know what he wins an Oscar for? For being a criminal, for being dirty. You know what I'm saying? Halle Berry, you know, all these roles she played. When she played that one role in Monsters Ball, she gets hit with it. So anything that's demeaning and negative to our community that is glorified, I'm here to counter those narratives. And that's what I've been working on the last few years.
Got it. So whenever this comes up, particularly when I'm talking to young folks, but it comes up, I think, almost all the time. I hear people say that Black folks are under a greater threat than ever from police brutality, right? And oftentimes what I'll say is, I think if and this is particularly if you're talking to someone who is African American and whose great grandparents were enslaved, I'll say, if your great grandparents were here and and they had been enslaved, I think that they might disagree with you. And I think, if their children who weren't enslaved but who were here during the lynching movement, I think that they would also disagree with you. But I think that what's different is that we have a more clear tracking method because of cameras, because of cell phone cameras. And I think that also because of police body cameras, that we have more information available. And so, but I do have this curiosity, particularly for North Carolina, about the effectiveness of camera footage, about whether or not it has been effective so far in moving the needle, certainly in police and holding police departments and police officers accountable for police brutality. And I don't know if that's something that you've come across in your studies, or if it's something that you have knowledge about.
Well, we're definitely familiar with it. And what you find is, unfortunately, like when you look at the National Institute of Justice that produces these kind of national studies as it pertains to body cams, as most recent as 2018, what you found is that about 75% of departments that actually use the body cams, the results are somewhat kind of inconclusive. You have instances where in some instances, some jurisdictions, some of the excessive force has gone down, but then the reports have increased. And then you find where the reports have increased, but the excessive force has or a decrease in the excessive force has increased. More importantly, what you find, and you guys have remembered this because this is the last 2 weeks or so, sometimes officers actually disengage their cameras, and that makes you wonder, okay, I mean, you don't have to be a PhD or MD or whomever to figure, okay, why are you turning off your camera? Like if you're supposed to keep it on. Right. So I think for the public's sentiment, I think many of us probably feel a tad bit more reassured rather, but the reality of it is, the data is still, we're still working on, getting more robust data as it pertains to departments that are actually using the cameras. I know I've seen it, locally, even, down to Charlotte, where they feel like it has been, quite receptive, and with meaning the department that is, and that, some would argue that the notion of the body cams is to hold officers accountable, to make them think, number one, but number two, to protect them from citizens who might be misleading as well. So it's not just, that's the one, caveat I do want to, state, that it's not just to hold officers accountable. Quite frankly, we have some folks out there who are living foul. We know that. Mm-hmm. So, it's to protect them as well. But definitely from a citizen standpoint, we're like, it should reassure us. And the research right now is still not as robust in favor of it. But I think more departments are going to it because the public sentiment is we want to see it. Now, they need to figure out how to not let them disengage it, because that's another issue.
Yeah. So one of my colleagues who I work with most frequently is Sadiqa Reynolds, who runs the Urban League in Louisville, Kentucky. And she is certainly a hero in terms of all the issues that she's been dealing with in Louisville around Breonna Taylor's murder at the hands of police. And, a few weeks ago at this point, police, of course, fired a shot that it seems frightened the owner of a barbecue shop. He came out and began shooting, and apparently he had been very friendly with police, and he fired a shot, not realizing that it was the police, and so the police immediately shot back at him, and he was killed. But what happens is that when the police department goes to investigate, and when the FBI goes to investigate, the entire police force that was out that night had their body cams turned off. And so, as many folks who've been following that may know, the mayor the very next morning fired the police chief because he was like, "Look, I have no confidence in you." At the point that that every single officer out there had their cameras turned off. I just can't. There's no way I can have any confidence in your leadership. But so, to your point, this idea that that the officers themselves have some ability to turn the cameras on and off, I think really it questions the functionality of the entire process and whether or not it can even be successful. I think the other interesting challenge around body cameras, particularly here in North Carolina, is that a number of jurisdictions wanted the ability to be able to share body cam footage, and of course the legislature pretty quickly jumped out and banned jurisdictions from being able to actually share the footage without intervention from a court. And so there have been a few circumstances where police departments wanted to share the footage, and maybe they didn't, but it didn't matter. They couldn't, right? And so certainly locally and across the state, the challenge is that the legislature had a more conservative stance, at least, than most jurisdictions did. Right?
And that proves to be problematic, because what happens is where for argument's sake, let's say a department is really, really trying to rebuild relationships with a respective community, and there is a shooting, and they want to appear transparent. They want, a chief or sheriff, depending on the jurisdiction, they want to, cooperate, but their hands are tied because our legislators in Raleigh, decided that this is not going to be appropriate until a judge gets involved. And we all know how that process can be. And in these instances, it doesn't take much for the community to really, we need immediate feedback in these instances to discern whether, okay, this is we don't want to see nobody shot, but it's not what it appears, or, we need somebody held accountable because this officer, unfortunately, it was a bad shoot. But when you restrain departments like that, it puts them in a precarious situation, because if you have a leader who wants to be, forthcoming and transparent, they can't. So then they're it's just not a good look when we're trying to rebuild relationships with police departments and the community.
Right. So Reverend Carlisle?
Yeah, James, before you jump off that too with body cam, and I was talking to some folk who made a suggestion that possibly, and I want to put this just before you and Dr. Manel and get your thoughts on it, about the possible creation of legislation that says it's evidence tampering for an officer who's engaged with a citizen to not have his camera engaged, because we know that that's their policy to have it on whenever they're having interaction with the citizen. But what is the repercussion? What happens if I say, yeah, I know that's the rules, that's what's supposed to happen, but it seems like there is no accountability if they don't have it on. And so I wanted to put before you all, what were your thoughts about possibly having or the feasibility of having state legislation that says an officer that disengages his camera would face some level of charge for evidence tampering or some form of other criminal offense?
So for me, I agree wholeheartedly, but once again, it leads towards that accountability. What we saw, what was it, yesterday, I believe the president signed whatever it was as an executive order pertaining to police. What he did was He just restated or he signed something symbolically that's already taken place. You know, we already train police departments, officers, you know, in diversity and excessive force. You know, there's already mechanisms in place to hold them accountable when they do those things, but we just do not apply it. And I think that's the problem. And I agree with you. I think they should be, criminally negligent when they do that. But unfortunately, with our legislature, that would be a tricky feat because, you know, right now, and for the viewers, you know, I'm not one of those individuals that, you know, I know we have individuals, you know, activists or otherwise, who be like, you know, anti-police. That's not my sentiment, you know, but I'm about equitable application of justice. You know, I have dear colleagues, friends, and family who are in law enforcement who work hard every day to be righteous. But let's not be naive. The system was never created nor intended to benefit us. It was created to control us. So we need a transformative application of revamping these departments like we're seeing in Camden, New Jersey, where the chief started from scratch. And murders and violent offenses went down dramatically because they said, yo, we're gonna approach this community. We're really gonna implement community policing. We're gonna demilitarize. We don't need tanks and grenade launchers and all that stuff, you know, and the community responded well to it. And now they work collaboratively.
Dr. Monell, your volume cut out for a moment. So if you could just repeat that about Camden, New Jersey, because I'm very familiar with Camden and that model, and I think it's really important for folks to hear that.
Absolutely, yeah. My apologies. So in Camden, New Jersey, what happened was that the newly assigned chief got rid of the entire department, all the officers, and they started recruiting from scratch with officers who were more so socially conscious in the sense that they were community driven. You know, you can't be protecting and serving if it's adversarial. And I think many departments today operate under the premise, or they operate under the guise of protecting and serve, but it's masked for adversarial. Because if you pull me over for speeding, which I shouldn't do, I get that. And if I say, good evening, officer, and he says license, registration, okay. But if he pulls me over and he's, antagonizing me, and then if I'm not secure in my manhood, I'll respond, and then it gets worse. That's just not what it should be about. And the temperament, oftentimes what we find is the temperament in the application of some of these cases are problematic. So for me, I like the Camden, New Jersey model, and I think it could work in many departments, and the community will see it, as something that's very beneficial. Secondly, when you have law enforcement policing a community, you got to have officers who represent that community. It's just, I'm at a historically Black college. Those students want to see us instructing them. You dig? I can empathize with them. I'm a first-gen college student too. I grew up in housing projects. I understand many of the plights of my students and young and old. So I think for many people in the community, when I grew up in New York City, we had, I grew up in Brooklyn, our officers all lived in Long Island in the suburbs, which was, for me, that was like, miles away. And they treated us as animals, man. And they said that. And, imagine growing up and, officers are looking at you like you're an animal. And I'm like, dude, what do you mean? So that kind of culture is what I'm hopeful will change. And I'm talking about 30 years, almost 40 years ago. And we're still talking about the way police departments treat us.
Yeah, I want to really encourage folks to take some time. I posted one article about the Camden Police Department, but there are a lot of articles about it. It really is an amazing model. Basically, every single police officer was fired, and so they started from scratch. They rehired officers, and a lot of times they rehired some of the same officers. A lot of officers though couldn't get rehired, but rehiring the officers and rebuilding the force meant that they didn't have the same police union situation. One of the big challenges for police departments tends to be having to navigate the police union. But in creating a new police force, it also meant that they were able to decide that the police force was the purpose was different, right? So, for instance, if you call about a mental health issue, well, they may not send the police department out for a mental health issue because people with guns aren't the folks who can help you with a mental health issue. Or if you call because you have a dispute with your neighbor, then they might send someone else who is better suited to help you talk through a problem with your neighbor, because you don't need someone with a gun to help you work through a dispute with your neighbor, right? And what they found over time is that complaints against police have dramatically dropped, and the homicide rate has decreased dramatically, and it's just a dramatically safer city. And so it's a really interesting and really smart model. And of course, it's not that they don't have a police department. It's not that that you can't call the police. It's simply that they have narrowed the scope of what the police do and really focused the police on issues of truly keeping the city safe and on actual issues of actual criminal issues, right? And not on issues that don't have anything to do with crime. I think sometimes we have police engaging all kinds of issues that have nothing to do with crime, collecting taxes, and if you're African American and you have a mental health issue, it's much more likely that your first engagement is going to be with a police officer rather than with a mental health professional. So,
and I'm gonna let Reverend, because I know Reverend Carlisle wanted to respond, but to your point about the mental health piece quickly, that's what they're doing in Dallas right now. In Dallas, what they're doing is they're assigning mental health practitioners, social workers, counselors with officers to kind of go out to these, those cases that you just mentioned. Because the reality of it is, all officers are not trained clinically or otherwise. And I get it. They may not know how to respond to those incidents. All they know how to do is, if they see somebody violent, they're going to respond the way I guess their training tells them to respond. So I think that point is critical. You see the same thing in social work where you do a child custody removal or you do investigations. A social worker typically will have an officer present, but they're the lead per se until it's time to remove the child. And if there's some issues, right, the officers intervene. And I think that's another kind of model that's gaining some momentum right now, because people realize that we have a lot of folks in our society who have a lot of issues, mental health wise or otherwise, that maybe an office is not well equipped, and maybe some other, social services, mental health practitioner can handle it in a more effective manner.
Right. Reverend Carlisle?
Yeah, actually, I was trying to jump in on the previous point before that we were making about we talked about the body cam, but I would just kind of add a brief comment to that. I think that's a lot of the strain that we see with this movement also, and I'm glad we're having this conversation, is that, you can't, it's hard to just wholesale, just get rid of the idea of police, but there is a reasonable form, a reasonable format, a reasonable place, that the police can operate, on some very serious issues. But I think the thing about it is a lot of times we scrap the whole thing kind of system. This in Camden, like you said, they scrapped the officers and rebuilt it something different. But the idea of the police still exists. And a lot of the pushback that I hear, people say, let's just get rid of the police. And I was like, I don't know if it's feasible. I get the idea, I get the sentiment, I get the point that you're trying to make. But old people, and I guess maybe I'm in with them, they say baby, you can't throw out the baby with the bathwater, you can't cut off your nose to spite your face. And as much negative and bad, performance that we've gotten from police, around the country, is the whole throwing away the whole wholesale idea of police. I think just really is not feasible. And I want to add this also too, back to the conversation about police, about body cams. We had a few years ago, and I don't know if you guys remember the situation with Travis Page out of Old Hall Road.
That's right.
And so, we called on the DA, we called out the DA, said, yo, we want to see this body cam. And eventually when we were able to see the body cam, it actually vindicated the police, and I think having rules to say, listen, give this to the public, because don't just make it available when it's going to shine a good light on the department. let us see it all, good or bad, because actually in that case it vindicated. I mean, a lot of the community didn't like it because there was a dead black man beside the road. But if you look at the video, it clearly shows that the brother fell, ended up having some physical problems before the officer even reached him. And and sometimes we don't like the truth, but that's plainly just what it showed. And but I think the problem a lot of times what we have is there's a willingness by DAs, judges, even the police department to share videos or body cam videos that show police in a favorable light. But I think you build trust with the community when you say, listen, we're going to make this information available, good, bad, or ugly. And a lot of times they, stand behind, well, there's an SBI investigation. We have to wait for this, wait for that. Well, regardless of if the SBI is investigating, it's still not going to change what's there. What's there is there. And sometimes things need to be put, in the court of public opinion. People need to see really what happened. So I just wanted to add that anecdote, again, to speak to, let's make these videos available to everybody. It benefits police, it builds trust, and also most importantly, it allows the community to hold police agencies accountable.
Sure. So, the conversation about, do you get rid of the police department? Do you rebuild a police department? Do you do away with the police department? I presume that this conversation enters the modern conversation because of the Black Lives Matter movement's call for defunding police, and which the co-founders of at least one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter is a dear friend of mine and my family's. But I would say that that it was poor marketing on their part, because I think that a lot of people, when they heard defund the police, presumed that it meant take away all money from police departments. But it turns out that that's not quite what they meant, and so I presume, Dr. Monell, is something that you've had a chance to take a look at and learn some more about. What's your interpretation or understanding of defund the police?
Yeah. To your point, unfortunately, man, they've taken the word, and it's just once again been misrepresented across the board. So what defunding the police means, and ultimately, what it means is that it's a reallocation of resources. And that's all it means, right? It's not disbandment. It's not, it's not firing officers. It's nothing of the sort. It's taking those resources and channeling them into social services programs, mental health programs, early interdiction programs, so that the community and the police departments can work collaboratively on the front end. So hopefully on the back end, there'll be fewer arrests, fewer violent encounters, excessive force encounters, because there's more of a relationship between the community and the police departments. And that's what it simply is. It's an opportunity to think about it like this. We invest millions and millions of dollars into police departments, which, they have an incredible role in our society, without a doubt. We don't give a fraction of that to educators. And that's a hard reality. Rev was talking about the truth. The truth of the matter is that our state legislature just this week gave a $350 bonus to educators. Well, I'm no accountant, but after taxes and everything else, maybe 150, 160, maybe $10 extra a month. Maybe you could supersize your McDonald's meal. That's an insult. So when we're talking about reallocation of resources, think about the impact that our educators have. Now, my wife's she's administrator. My wife's educator, so I'm gonna rock with her, right? And I know the work she does, but it's like I've been all over the world. I've been blessed that way. When I taught at a university in South Korea, them man, they have so much deference for educators out there that I really had to think, do I want to come back to the States? Because they treated me like royalty. And that's how our kids spend at least 8 hours a day in schools. And we pay these teachers. These teachers are working 3 and 4 jobs. They're stressed. They got families. it's unfathomable that that we treat teachers this way. And so my point is, that's a perfect example of when we talk about defunding, how about reallocating some resources into our education where teachers, qualified teachers, can prepare young people to engage as citizens and with our community members and our law enforcement in a different manner. And that's kind of what defunding it is.
And so, you know, one of the at least locally, the big debate had been around a proposal by Councilman Taylor to move $1 million from the police budget into anti-poverty programs. And I'll just pause right here and just say that, you know, that the Urban League has a bit of a conflict of interest in that one of the programs would have been the Summer Youth Employment Program that we oversee. But ultimately, it would have been money that that had been previously allocated for police roles that it looked like would not have been filled in the coming fiscal year, and so instead of filling those roles, the money would have been allocated to various anti-poverty programs that the city funds. And so this is $1 million out of the city's total $79 million police budget. And so there was a lot of pushback, there was a lot of controversy, and so there was a kind of a revision of the proposal, but not the original version of the proposal, you know, because of all the pushback. It wasn't able to get the original proposal through. And so, you know, I guess you know, going back to this conversation about the Camden, New Jersey model and about the Dallas model, in the end, when you talk about those models and you talk about this idea of having police departments, of removing some of the functions from police departments, so that, for instance, a police department is not policing schools anymore, and instead you have folks playing a role in schools who are not armed guards, or so that police are not playing a mental health or behavioral health role in the community. When you say those things to people, people most of the time say, "Oh, well, that makes a lot of sense to me," right? But when you break it apart and propose each individual concept to people, and when you take race out of it and you talk to people, kind of across the board, people say, "Oh, yeah, why would you have the police dealing with mental health? That doesn't make any sense." But the moment that it becomes part of the Black Lives Matter movement, and that we talk about it in the context of this moment, it's controversial, right? And you know, which I think is perhaps the greatest challenge of this moment. And so, so I want to pause right here and just ask you, Dr. Monell, because in the end, part of what we want to get to is passing policy. If the city council, you know, after this meeting came to the three of us and said, "All right, we heard that conversation that you had, and we think we can get, you know, one piece of legislation through, and, you know, we don't think we can get more than one, but we think we can get one." Well, you know, what is the one thing that you would prioritize? What's the one thing that you would say, "All right, if we do this, you know, there's always so much more that we ought to do, but we do this one thing right now, it is it at least gets us started, or it gives us the most opportunity for change in this moment." Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Yeah, my bad. I had to dig right into that one. So I have a laundry list, right? But the first thing I will say that was very important to me was the Second Chance Act, right? So what we find is when we allow individuals, ex-offenders, to reintegrate successfully back into our society, they can contribute through their efforts, through the workforce, and through other elements of our society. So that was a major thing. When they have to check that box, you know, and jobs are turning them away, then their only other recourse, if they can't find gainful employment, is to go back to ways that they were initially accustomed to. So that's, for me, that's one thing. So the Second Chance Act was big. Another thing is, for me, when I'm talking about the criminal justice system specifically, is that we need to release these nonviolent offenders, and these drug offenders, particularly the marijuana offenders. If we have individuals, and actually Representative Montgomery is one of his initiatives with the marijuana piece as far as decriminalizing it, because the reality of it is, if we get these folks back into our society, reintegrate them back into our society, and stop criminalizing, the Black male per se, then that particularly that component, which is what I focus on, then we can see some paradigm shifts, right? Because the reality of it is, if we keep incarcerating people for nonviolent offenses, if they can't, because of those offenses, gain licensure or good jobs to provide for themselves or their families, they will go back to criminality. You don't need a PhD to figure that out, unless they're just very, resourceful and entrepreneurial. And we know there's barriers in place for that, particularly after this pandemic, where all our small businesses are closing down now. So those are two. I have many others, and then taking the SROs out of the schools. I published a paper several years ago about the politicization of school prison pipelines. And what you find is, after the Gun Act, what you found is they started placing all these police officers in schools, to stop gun violence. I get that. I'm all, listen, we don't want our kids, no doubt. But mass school shootings never happened in urban America. They happen in suburban schools. So, there was once again, listen, we can stay on this for hours. You will not find one urban school where there was a mass shooting. But you see all the police officers, to your point, James, about going to Harlem after leaving Manhattan or downtown Manhattan. It's like they channel their energy. So if we're talking about action plans, continue to decriminalize the marijuana sales. As long as we have these corporations making millions about it, we need to get these guys out. And then secondly, continued efforts with the Second Chance Act and ensuring that these people are able to get employed, get licenses, things of that nature, that those respective convictions may prohibit them from obtaining.
And I want to just pause here on the issue of police and school in Winston-Salem and Forsyth County, and I want to give props to the superintendent of the Winston-Salem Forsyth County Public Schools, because she did, frankly, without very much pushing from the community, take the initiative to push to get police out of schools here in Winston-Salem, Forsyth County, and it's something that deserves, I think, great support and accolades, and it's a very heroic and step forward for, and something that we're very proud of. What I like to do, Dr. Monell. So I asked you, I asked you that unfair question. I asked you about the one policy, right? But it sounded like, though, obviously you had more, because I've been on panels before and had sessions where people ask me about the one, and I'm a housing guy. It's where I started my work. So if you weren't limited to the one, what tell us about some of the other issues or other policies that you push on.
Well, as we so my early research, my focal point is juveniles, obviously adolescents. So once again, channeling our resources and energy to early intervention. So we have to work on addressing juvenile delinquency and juvenile justice as it pertains to our respective community. Now, we did raise the age and things of that nature. That was a big thing when I first came here, and I know that was an initiative to work on, because criminalizing juveniles at 16 when they're still in high school, listen, everybody makes mistakes. I'm a product of it, I know. So, with that being said, that was, for me, is the focus on early. I hate reactionary, plans, right? And I know sometimes some of these things require reactionary approaches, but if we can address them on the front end, education, food deserts. Winston-Salem State is in East Winston. East Winston is one of the poorest communities in the country, not just the state, one of the poorest in the community. Reinvesting in poor communities like that, ensuring that the residents, have viable options, healthcare. And I know now I'm going a little bit off tangent, but there's so many things structurally. When we talk about criminality, all of those variables contribute in one way or another, indirectly or
It's all
otherwise.
connected. It's all connected. Right.
If you don't have food to eat, if you have poor health care, if you're self-medicating because you don't have insurance to go to mental health treatment, all of these factors contribute to why people commit crimes, why communities are fractured, why couples interpersonal violence. Now, this is an interesting stat, and it's not interesting, it should almost be expected, but interpersonal violence crimes have increased dramatically since COVID, since March, because you have couples together who've already had strained relationships now are stuck together and is becoming more volatile. So, these are the issues we face. It's so systemic and institutional that, sometimes when people say, well, what's the one thing? I'm like, listen, man, I got a list, it's like, but the reality of it is efforts like yours, James, and the Urban League, and Reverend Carlisle, and the ministry, and the work that the gentlemen do here, and the strong women in leadership. The one thing I like about Winston-Salem, listen, I'm a Yankee, but I will say this. I lived in Charlotte, and I know there might be some Charlotte folks up there. They probably go badmouth me. I like Charlotte, but I'll be honest with you. There's something to be said about a smaller city that kind of can appreciate its little Southern charm with a little bit of progressive movements. And I love access. I like to be able to reach out to my leaders. And I think that's something that makes our community unique in the South, particularly in Carolina. And I think if all of our efforts, if we continue to work together in our respective areas, this is going to be my home for the next, 10, 20, 30, who knows? But as long as I live here and I can breathe, I'm going to speak out against injustices. And I know you brothers would do the same. So, we just got to address all those elements. And it's embarrassing when you look at certain schools in poorer communities, but then you go to the nicer communities, well, what appears to be nicer. And then, and I know our council folk are going to say, well, listen, I know how the politics game works. I lived in DC. So, my thing is we have to continue to push and apply pressure to the people who make these decisions, because they all will always resort to criminality. Because I'm going to tell you, if we're going through the ATM and if there's a young sister, young brother who's either addicted to drugs or, doesn't have a job, and if they need to eat or they need to survive, people will do desperate things to survive. So before we start throwing stones at people who are involved in the criminal justice system, look at yourself and figure out what you can do to contribute to hopefully better their lives.
No, absolutely. But just that earlier point about the connections and about the way that your housing circumstance is connected to your mental health circumstances, connected to your health circumstances, connected to whether or not you have healthy food in your community, and every single bit of it is connected, and there's no way that you escape it. So I also. So you and I, again, being transplants, it's an experience that we both share. I tell people this all the time, and I actually said it to the mayor probably a month or so ago. I've never been in a city where I could email the mayor or call the mayor and I get my phone call or email returned on the same day. And I've been, I've bothered a lot of mayors in my time, and usually I got to raise some hell in order to get a response. So it's a unique experience that's relative to this city. Look, so I want to ask you a bit of a personal question. Two different personal questions. So the first one is about the way that communities that we respond as a community when we see or hear about the death of an African-American man, right? What is incredibly moving is that there is a way that we have learned to mobilize, that we've mobilized around the death of Tamir Rice, that we mobilized around the death of George Floyd, that we mobilized around, and unfortunately, I can go down a list. And when I go down that list, people who are on this Zoom and who are on Facebook will know the names. But if I start to name African-American women who also died at the hands of police, if I name maybe Sandra Bland, I think a few folks would know Sandra Bland's name. But if I start to name more African-American women, then a lot of folks won't know the names. If I say Maya Hall, if I say Corinne Gaines, people are going to have to start to actually go and do some research. So people have, of course, there's now a movement, the Say Her Name movement. I'm curious about what it is that has happened such that that it is so easy for us to say his name, but not to say her name and to remember her name. And so that in this moment, it was easy for us to mobilize around George Floyd, but it took so long for us to become mobilized for Breonna Taylor.
Yes. So quite frankly, obviously I don't profess to be the voice for all Black males.
Of course,
so
of course.
This is clearly just an observation, personal and historical, I guess, to a degree. But sadly, what you find is that oftentimes the focus has always been the Black males in these instances, right? I think more recently Sandra Bland, she there was some momentum with that. And then, of course, more recently, Breonna Taylor. But sadly, she was the direct result of everything else happening to males. And I think the momentum just carried over to her. And I think as a community, this is once again just kind of a personal position. I just think, we need to do better to honor our women in life and sadly in death in these instances. And most recently, a young sister, 19-year-old from Florida, Toyin, who was trending, online, who was sexually assaulted. She went online, disclosed it. The Tallahassee, the police down there, I guess didn't respond. I don't know all the particulars, but then she went missing, and then she was killed. She was murdered, and she was an advocate. She was a Black Lives Matter activist down there. Very vocal, very bright young lady. In fact, I was on a panel yesterday with a young lady who went to school with her. So I was kind of taken aback by that. Like, man, damn, like, wow. So I think we as a community, Black males more specifically, need to ensure that we do better, right? And that's just a general statement. People may disagree, and that's fine. I'm a big boy, but we have to do better. For those of us married, obviously we have our wives. The way I operate is I treat women that I may see, in the parking lot at Walmart. I kind of keep my head on swivel, and I would hope that the same would be when my wife maybe is by herself coming out with groceries. We've always been our brother's keeper to a degree, and we unfortunately have not been our sister's keeper the way we should have. Now, women, our sisters, they always got our back. And that's that's the reality of their essence. And I think we just got a lot of work to do. And that's, that's kind of the best way I can say that. I don't profess to know why every sister that dies in the hands of police or otherwise, that we don't move zealously like we do for the males. I can only hope and pray that moving forward, that we cherish all of them and honor them by making sure that there's justice at the hands of at the hands of whoever perpetrated these crimes. So that's that's kind of my stance on that, man.
Absolutely, I appreciate that. In the comments, I'm posting just a few links for folks to track the Say Her Name movement, and Say Her Name movement was started by Kim Crenshaw, who also, of course, is the founder or created the term intersectionality. And so, but she is the person who began to push on this fundamental issue. And I see the requests for the story in Florida, and I'll post a link to that story too in a moment. Tell me about when you first heard about Ahmaud Arbery. What was your immediate response? And I'd like to hear both from you and from Reverend Carlisle, and particularly because, you know, so many of us were locked down because of COVID-19, right? And so it was already a fairly unique time and a different time, and we were going through. I think a lot of us were going through unique emotions and feelings and trying to figure things out, and I think a different way of living. Tell me about how you experienced learning about that, and just about what your overall thoughts were and how you experienced it, because it's a different circumstance. It's not a police murder, but it's and the facts kind of come out, they kind of drip out, if you will.
So, you know, so you're absolutely right. You know, we're on lockdown, and you know, my first knowledge of it, you know, is through social media. You know, I see something trending about a video, and you know, and the one thing I personally don't do is that I don't tend to retweet or repost videos where I see us getting killed. There's enough trauma out there. I'm not going to be the disseminator of that kind of information. So I saw it. You know, I tell my wife, you know, then I tell my sons. And so I'm processing it. And my first instinct, my first response is, damn, I mean, even in COVID, we're not safe, right? I mean, we're in isolation and we can't, you know, and then, you know, of course this is more so kind of like a Zimmerman type of case, you know, for those who recall Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman. I wrote a paper on that some years ago. And, I just got infuriated, to be honest, man, to keep it 100, right? I was just like, you know, now I'm not a jogger, but I'll walk outside. But, you know, any one of us could be outside going for a walk or jogging. And I alluded to this earlier in the evening. Some gentlemen, I'm using that word very loosely, decide we don't belong, or they maybe saw us looking at a home being built. Now, I'll tell y'all, brothers, I can't tell you how many times my wife and I were walking in a development community and we looked at the house because we wanted to get some, let's look, right? So my thing is, that could have been me, that could have been her, that could, you know. So once again, I just get infuriated that this apathy, you know, I don't care what the narrative is. They hunted that brother down and they killed him. You know, I don't care what they say, because the reality of it is, if you understand Georgia law, their argument of citizens arrest doesn't mesh with the statute. So that's a farce. You hunt a dude down. Let me tell you something. If 3 black, white, or whomever chase me down, and if somebody's pointing a shotgun at me, you best believe I'm gonna try to get that shotgun out of his hand, or if I'm not prepared to handle it myself. So, I mean, come on, y'all. So, you know, my thing is, we still have communities that look at black males like criminals. And this is kind of like my life's work, like, you know, and it's not my job to change the races. So let me put that out there so people can see that. It is not my job to educate racists or educate white folks about racism. Nah, cuz Google it, go to a library and learn about it, you know, because the reality of it is that's not my obligation. My obligation is fracturing it and doing away with it. Your job is to be educated. You're a big person. You're grown up. So, you know, for me, man, I was just hurt, man. Because like you know, we're men. I have grown-ish sons, because they still in my pockets. I have grown-ish, you know, and it's like, you know, one of them works later, one of them works earlier, and you know, I'm always worried. And you know, you kind of, you know, you leave it with your higher being, like you just pray on it and just be like, you know, God, just make sure he gets back to my house uneventful, whatever. And he knows. And You can imagine being my son, because they get all of this. I used to work for the government, so they get that part of it. Now they get this, and they get the hood stuff. So it's like, my sons, they are very, well-versed in kind of my activism and my activities. And they just cognizant that, listen, man, just be smart out there. Even with police encounters, we do this modeling all the time. Because I'm like, you don't want your dad to take off the tie and you want me to stay a professor. So let's, and that doesn't exclude that they can be victimized, obviously, because that's what we're seeing. We're seeing people being victimized in instances where they shouldn't have. So to answer your question, and man, I just incredibly hurt, and I'm gonna let the Rev go, but I was just like, sheesh, man, we're on a lockdown, and a brother still can't go out and get some fresh air without being worried about some jokers, hunting him down. Like this is like the 50s or the 40s, with the Klan. The only difference is they don't have their hoodies on anymore, and that's how I feel. And I'll be brutally honest with you. I don't care who I offend when it comes down to that, because you can't. And I'm an intelligent person. You cannot tell me there's any other reason. If that was a white person jogging down that road that they didn't know, they wouldn't have approached him that way. I don't care what they say. So that kind of. I'm gonna let the Rev go, because I might go some places, and I know we live. I don't want to do it.
James, but frankly, man, to be frank about it, I was very pissed off. I mean, when I saw the details, man, I was just, on my soapbox, upset. But more than just angry at these guys, I was angry at the whole environment that we've come to in America. I mean, don't get me wrong. Black folk been getting killed beside the road for a long, long time. But this whole age of Trumpism, these divisive politics, these kind of instances are the fruit, are the offspring when you continue to advance this divisive. And many other politicians now, even on the local and state levels, have bought into this divisive politics. Moving in their political campaigns in a kind of way to perpetuate this great divide, and I thought about these are the people, these are the type of people who become emboldened. I'm going to check, that guy, I'm going to see what's going on with this N-word. That's the kind of environment, that's the kind of attitude, that's the kind of mindset. Dr. Manel said something powerful. He said, listen, it's not my job to educate folk on racism, and if folk want to find out about it, that's their job to do. But the thing about it, I look at the racist ideology of many people. You can't unteach that level of ignorance. I tell people all the time, Hillary called them deplorables, but at the end of the day, you can't re-educate these people. It's not our job to re-educate them. But what it is, our job is to counteract it. It's our job to outvote it. It's our job not to try to overcome hate with hate, but as Dr. King said, overcome it with love, and to build and to build some more, because those people are going to be around. Those men who gunned that young man down, they were emboldened, and we live in an environment now where people are becoming more and more. And I know I'm not the only one who senses the energy. I mean, the energy is real. The energy is out there. That there's this great divide that's being created, and I feel like what happened that day was the fruit of it. And and then more than just mad at that instance, it made me mad at where we have come to. And the truth of the matter, and I'll close with this: you can't re-educate, you can't change their mind. A lot of that stuff is been embedded for generations. It's a generational stronghold. It's been in this land. Since it was taken from the natives, but it is a mindset that's continued to be perpetuated, and a lot of these far right folk, a lot of these who uphold Trump, we talk a lot about Trump himself, but the U.S. Senate could check Trump in a minute, but there's a whole movement to create this division, and people feel like they could win political office, they could curry favor with people because of that mindset. That's what I was upset about, James. I was just mad that this is the culture, this is America, this is this is where we live now, and you know, and it's frustrating. It makes you mad. But I'll say this in closing: we can't re-educate these folks. We can't reprogram them. You know, they're stuck in their mindset and their way and ideology. But the sad thing about it is they vote at a very high clip, and people think they outnumber us, but they don't. Justice-loving folk outnumber those kind of people. You know, people who believe in equity and justice. We outnumber those kind of people. We just don't vote at a high enough clip. If we ever decide to go to the polls, we can't change their mindset, but we can definitely make sure that their ideologies are not perpetuated on the roadside, on a jogger who was simply minding his own business.
Dr. Monell, we tried to honor our commitment and close at 7 o'clock each night, both because it's close to dinner time and simply because we try to do what we said we would do. And so I want to give you a little bit of time to offer some closing comments before we close things down.
No, I definitely appreciate it, brother. Definitely appreciate it. I guess for me, for the viewership, you know, what I oftentimes tell my undergraduates or organizations that I speak to is that everyone protests differently. The revolution is not comfortable, right? So in order to impact social injustices, we all will have to sacrifice something. And we've all, whether it's time, energy, money, you know, families, whatever the case may be, I challenge all of you to use your gifts. Everyone is not going to march. Everyone's not going to speak. Some of you guys are writers. Some of you guys are thinkers, strategizers. But if you're passionate, as you should be at this moment in our country's history, to contribute to social change, I just challenge you to do so in a manner. Mobilize, as Reverend stated, you know, the vote is incredibly important. And not just the November vote. I know we get caught up on the presidential vote, but local politics is key. They're the ones who decide if the Breonna Taylor killers get indicted or get arrested or not. You know, local politics, state level politics, be involved, know who your legislators are, write them, call them, email them, tweet them, harass them. You know, we are their constituents. Reclaim your time, like Auntie Maxine said, you know, and let them know our worth. This is our time. In my generation, outside of 9/11, I've never seen a movement this magnificent, right? So just let's take this momentum, and Reverend Carlisle said this earlier, and let's transfer that to action steps, voting, you know, mobilization, voting, policy changes, accountability, hold our leaders accountable. Every voice matters, not just the wealthy ones, not just the ones who are not as wealthy, not just the middle class. We all matter. So ensure that you do so. And more importantly, you know, for my brothers out there, man, let's honor these women, y'all. Real talk. Let's honor these women. Let's protect our women, protect our families, protect our communities. And for my fam out there, you know, kind of run the streets a little bit, man. I was that dude once upon a time. You can't be tough and wild and big time in your street, but you quiet when it comes down to racial injustices. So if you're gonna be bad in your neighborhood, be bad when them jokers are chasing us down and killing us. Other than that, follow me on Twitter, Jack Monell, LinkedIn, Jack Monell, and Instagram, Project Kid with a PhD. Y'all stay blessed, stay safe, wear the mask. North Carolina, we're spiking. Wear the mask.
That's right.
Thank you, y'all. Thank you, man.
Reverend Carlisle, you're on mute.
Again, I just want to say to everybody, this is the 5th night of this 5-part series, but it's not over. We're just getting started. Again, we need to stay connected. James and I, we're gonna try to pull together everybody's comments, suggestions. Make sure we get something valuable that we can bring out of this series. There's a lot of work to be done. We're staying connected again with other activists around here locally, around the state, even around the country, that we're going to continue this work. So let's just make sure to stay informed, stay connected. Whatever you do, go to naacpws.org and get your membership, because we are indeed the oldest and boldest civil rights organization in these United States of America. Thank you all for being a part of this time.
All right. Shouts out to April Johnson, to Jessica Leach. Thank you, Heather Davis, for your participation. And she gave a shout out to you, Dr. Monell, a few times. I think I want to say what's up to Whit Davis, Shay Woodbury. Thank you for joining us. She was on the panel, the education. She joined us at the last minute on the education panel last night. I want to thank Sarah DeVoe, who is interning at the Urban League this summer. Thank you for all your help and your support. Mag, who has been on every single conversation. I really appreciate you. Gloria Hairston as well. And a ton of other folks, more folks than I can name. Thank you all. Thank you for your support. And again, this is the last in this series. And we're going to put these, all the notes and details from these conversations together, and we're going to turn this into actionable policy, and we're going to push the council and the county commission to try to make some real change in these communities. Dr. Monell, thank you so very much. Thank you for your time. I firmly believe that there's no more precious resource for humans than time, and so the fact that you were so gracious to give of yours, we greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, brother. My pleasure, man.
All right. Y'all have a good night.
Take care.